I realize that seeing images once through in this way is not the same as living with the book of them properly presented, a book which I hope to publish before too long. But it gives us a basis for discussion. It's only fair that I give you the benefits of some of my now over 7 years of research into Meatyard and his work, and this particular body of work in particular. First, a very distilled comment on what I see as the meaning of the work, then a look at the origins, the elements of thinking, reading, and artistic ambition and biographical circumstance that lie behind some of the artistic decisions Meatyard made, and finally a look at the structure of the piece and how it operates on at least 3 levels, quite apart from those that you will be particularly attuned to as students of the visual arts, that is to say, the formal construction and composition of each image. Let me begin by being honest. When I began trying to grapple with Lucy Bell as an aesthetic performance, I found it daunting or boring, depending on how you react to the form. But the same can be said of Gertrude Stein's work, especially The Making of Americans, a work which had a lot of influence on Meatyard in the creation of Lucy Bell, a point I'll elaborate on in a minute when I talk about origins. Here we have 64 images culled from an original body of 97, according to Meatyard, and they seem very much the same, at least superficially. Each contains 2 figures in a frieze-like, rather formal yet vernacular pose, not, as many have said, I think mistakenly, reflecting a snapshot aesthetic. Meatyard has gone out of his way to evoke not the snapshot album of the 60s and 70s, but the look of albums from an earlier era. Through the ritualistic posing, he has, in a sense, pushed the work further back in time in terms of the formal signs and signals it conveys than do the evidence of costume and background in the pictures. In each we have one masked figure, repeating, paired with a new figure, but a figure wearing the same semi-transparent aged man's mask. You'll remember we saw in that last image, or next to the last image earlier, this issue of transparency and masking together in the boy with the shard of glass. This is an issue that will come up throughout. So we have these 64 images and we ask ourselves, what's going on? If we have the advantage of the captions, and you are a select group who's now seen this work as close to Jean Meatyard's intentions as can be gotten, we learn something about the family relationships, though not much. And in other cases, we seem to learn something about the figure. We know that they are friends of various kinds. We learn enough to have a sense of enigma, to generate some curiosity, at least some puzzlement, and perhaps some feeling. One figure, for example, is described as praiseworthy and kind. But for the most part, we sense quite correctly, as my biographical research confirms, a sense of humor with a bit of sarcastic edge, teasing edge to it. I'll talk more about the captions also and the way that each begins and ends with the repetition of the name Lucy Bell a bit later as we talk about the structure of the work. But for now, it's enough to say that we recognize that something is being driven home in all this repetition. The repetition as well as the variation in the elaborated social structure surrounding a central character, Lucy Bell. This seems to be aiming at the articulation of some meaning. And while the faces are hidden, and most of the people are relatively unknown, even though we are given their names in a list at the back of the book, this is a kind of coy revelation and concealing of information simultaneously. Again, a version of transparency and masking. But some major aspects of Lucy Bell's meaning are not difficult to see. The work affirms some verities of human existence which may, to many, seem hard or seem disquieting. Number one among them, surely, there's the notion that we all wear masks of various sorts. And yet we also reveal ourselves, or aspects of ourselves, to one another in all sorts of ways. Through our posture, which stands for our behavior in these photographs, through our surroundings and our relation to them. And yet the mask continually reminds us of the very real limitations, the insurmountable limitations upon our ability to really know one another. If I wear one mask for the man I want to hire me for a job, and another for my wife, and another standing here before you in New York giving this presentation, where does the real me reside? Is there a place where identity stands nakedly apart from the roles we play? At the same time, the work affirms, or seems to affirm, the idea that we need each other. that who we are is an amalgam of the projections and reflections, again, the transparency and masking, of ourself in the network of friends and relations in which we exist, and from which we inevitably derive much of the meaning of who we are. Further, a few moments' contemplation of the work and of the idea of the mask as we know it in the world culture reminds us that just as our relationships are an amalgam of projection and reflection, so too masks do not just conceal, they also reveal. When the Tibetan dancer puts on the mask of the dark horse, it's hoped that he becomes the dark horse and has a transcendent spiritual experience, that he participates in an older story, a more lasting story than the story of his particular transient life. So masks, while they can conceal our features, may free us to reveal more of what we are or wish to be. In the Lucy Bell series, we have the sense that innocence and serendipity have combined with formal control and an aesthetic litany, which has been socially ritualized here among a set of friends and relations, to realize a complex work with universal implications. Much has been made about the fact that Jean Midyard discovered in the spring of 1970 that he was dying of terminal cancer. And so some people have viewed this work as having a heavy, threnodic, mournful subtext. I differ and have long resisted this view because in Buddhism, which Midyard studied and took great comfort from and extended comfort to Cranston Ritchie with, sees life in death and vice versa. But at the same time, I will have to say that the more I've studied it, the more I've realized that all art is historicized, or should be. It takes place in a particular, comes out of a particular person at a particular time, and if we try to pretend that its meaning is totally separable from all that context, we're just fooling ourselves. So the long shadows that rake these suburban landscapes and the very ritualized recording of relationships one by one suggest, as photographs by their very nature of the medium, or at least as we habitually think of that, the medium anyway, suggest that we are engaged in an effort at holding on to something human that is passing, even as we're building a monument to something human that is quite lasting and universal. Our need for one another, even if we cannot, with absolute certainty, know one another. So let me elaborate just a little bit more on the origins of Lucy Bell. Midyard was interested all his artistic life in finding appropriate pre-existing forms to respond to and transform. In his correspondence with Thomas Merton, we find him saying, "Send me a poem that I can respond to photographically," or maybe let me send you a photograph that you can respond to poetically, this interrelation of forms. And the same thing comes up in the correspondence with the poet and publisher Jonathan Williams. In his diary in 1958, we find there's one entry in which we have a whole gush of enthusiasm. He lists a whole roster of forms to use as skeletons for creating images, including hymns, for example. And there are among his papers a set of sketches that he made for a series of photographs which he never made, which would have been responses to the opening verses of the book of Genesis. So in this vein, Midyard had been interested in creating a family album for a long time, and as early as 1967 he was producing images like these, which are from a set owned by the Visual Studies Workshop and which his son Christopher regards as a kind of first draft for Lucy Bell. But note the important differences. He's still out among the ruins here, the abandoned houses. The masks vary and the feeling is one of an absurdist picnic. A snapshot aesthetic does dominate here in a way that does not in the final album. He hasn't yet found the appropriate form for his idea. You'll note that in Lucy Bell, as we have it, the habitations that you see in the background, with one exception, are not derelict. They are inhabited living dwellings. Early in 1970, a number of influences converged on Midyard that resolved the artistic problem he'd been working with and gave Lucy Bell its final ritualized, poetic portrait album shape. Everyone has heard that the name Lucy Bell derives from a short story by Flannery O'Connor, and it does, and I'll get to O'Connor's influence in a moment. But first, let me acquaint you more fully with what I regard as an equally important, perhaps more important, aesthetic influence. The ideas and writings by Gertrude Stein, whom Midyard was then reading. Indeed, he wrote his publisher that the jacket copy on the edition of Stein's The Making of Americans well expressed what he was doing in Lucy Bell. The Making of Americans is itself a family album. It's an attempt to create a portrait of an entire American family through all its generations. The book is not easy reading. It's 416 pages in the 1934 edition. But because I think you will begin to see what I'm talking about in terms of influence better if I give you a tiny taste of the book, let me read you the last 8 sentences. I do so to make 2 points. First, the obvious thematic relationships between the way Stein resolves her family album and the way Meadyard resolves his. And second, to illustrate some parallels in formal method. Any family, being existing, is one having some being then not having come to be a dead one. Everyone in a family living, having come to be dead ones, some are remembering something of some such thing. Some, being living, not having come to be dead ones, can be one's being in a family living. Some, being living and having come to be old ones, can come then to be dead ones. Some, being living and being in a family living, and coming then to be old ones, can come then to be dead ones. Anyone can be certain that some can remember such a thing. Any family living can be one being existing, and some can remember something of some such thing. Aside from thematic matters of living and dying and memory, which run through the passage and through Lucy Bell, and through much of the critical theory about photography from Roland Barthes to Susan Sontag, for that matter, we have aesthetic form in this passage which finds a visual analog in Lucy Bell. We might call it repetition, but Stein wouldn't, and I don't think Meadyard would either. Let Stein explain the dynamics of what's going on formally. In the essay called Portraits and Repetition from her collection Lectures in America, she says, "There is the important question of repetition. And is there any such thing? Is there repetition, or is there insistence? I am inclined to believe there is no such thing as repetition. And really, how can there be? This is the thing about which I want you to think before I go on telling about portraits of anything. Expressing anything, there can be no repetition because the essence of that expression is insistence. And if you insist, you must each time use emphasis. And if you use emphasis, it is not possible, while anybody is alive, that they should use exactly the same emphasis. And so let us think seriously of the difference between repetition and insistence." It would abuse you in a setting like this for me to go on quoting Gertrude Stein, but I commend this short essay to you. In it, she goes on to talk about moving from California to Baltimore and listening to her many aunts gossip. They didn't get out much, but they told stories constantly, and they told the same stories. But then she began to realize that they weren't the same stories, that each time they were a different story, and that they were important for exactly that reason. They were living and growing and changing all the time. Even in their repetition and their sameness, they had a kind of life. So, not repetition, but insistence, and the assertion of emphasis, which we might call passion, certainly emotion, working toward the simultaneous construction and conveyance of meaning. This is the central method, the aesthetic of Lucy Bell. Flannery O'Connor. Let me leave Gertrude Stein and skip to Flannery. Why Lucy Bell and not Lucy Nell, as in the story? I don't know. Lucy Bell is more southern sounding, perhaps, and Nell more funereal. It's the way the name is repeated in the story that is of the greatest importance, where a character introduces herself saying, "Name's Lucy Nell Crater, and this is my daughter, Lucy Nell Crater." Meadyard's edition of the O'Connor stories was published in 1970, and he undoubtedly read The Life You Say May Be Your Own, which is the story from which the name derives, in it. But I've come to believe that when he did, a chain of associative light bulbs began to go off in his head. First, I believe he remembered seeing this story before on television. Meadyard's visual memory is legendary. Guy Davenport cites a couple of amazing examples and things he's written about Jean. It's interesting that the only one of O'Connor's short stories to be dramatized on television during Meadyard's lifetime was this one. And it wasn't staged once, but twice in separate productions. Let me show you a minute and a half of the 1957 Schlitz Playhouse version, which aired on WLEX Channel 18 in Lexington on March 1st, 1957, and which I think Meadyard saw because they just moved the year before from an apartment on Glendale Road into a new house at 418 Kingsway, and they'd finally bought a television set, and Gene had it on all the time, even when he was reading. Note 3 things about the clip you're about to see. Agnes Moorehead as Lucy Nell the Elder, the emphasis on the difficulty of knowing the truth of another's identity, and the listing of funny names.
Nothing's like it used to be, lady.
That's right. You from around here?
My name's Tom. Tom T. Triplett.
Oh, pleased to meet you. Name's Lucy Nell Crater. My daughter, Lucy Nell Crater. What you doing around here, Mr. Triplett? Where you come from, Mr. Triplett?
Lady, nowadays people do almost anything. I can tell you my name is Tom T. Triplett, and I come from Tarwater, Tennessee, but you never seen me before. How you know I ain't lying? How you know I ain't Aaron Sparks from Singleberry, Georgia? Or how you know I ain't George Speeds from Gracie, Alabama? Or how you know I ain't Thomas Bright from Tula Falls, Mississippi?
Oh, I don't know nothing about you.
Lady, people don't care how they lie nowadays. Maybe the best thing I can tell you is I'm a man. But listen, lady, what is a man?
That's what television is called.
I don't need to say much about the parallels between the thematic ethos of this story and Lucy Bell. We covered that earlier, talking about the relationship of a mask to questions of identity. But whether in reading or watching the story, I'm sure the list of funny names caught Gene's attention because just as big old $10 words interested him, so did funny names. He collected them in 2 pocket-sized brown loose-leaf notebooks. Names like Violet Rose, Columbus, Ohio; Bruce Rollover, Stamping Ground, Kentucky; Cecil Raw, Round Hole, Illinois. He saw humor and commentary embedded in life everywhere. But look at Agnes Moorehead's face. To my mind, it bears a remarkable similarity to the Lucy Bell crater mask, which you see in the lower left there as it survives today 30 years later. The high cheekbones, the peculiar nose, and of course, Moorehead wouldn't have just been a distant memory in 1970. She had a prominent role on Bewitched, which, as it happens, was one of Madeline Meadyard's favorite programs. And who knows, Gene might have caught Moorehead in this appearance on Password, trying to guess, of all things, the word mask.
9 points, Miles.
Halloween.
5 seconds.
You're in my territory, too.
5 seconds.
Eve?
Eve, no.
When the Meadyard saw the 1957 broadcast Can't Be Proven, though Madeline told me not long ago that the Agnes Moorehead connection rang a bell. But whether the story or the TV version or both, there's one more point to be made here relevant to Lucy Bell, and that's the appearance of Janice Rule, who played Lucy Bell the Younger in the story, which is the point that's made in the story of her hair. It's her beauty. As one character says, she's like an angel from God. You'll notice Madeline in that 1948 photo below her had striking platinum blonde hair, which was often commented upon. And you see Agnes Moorehead and Lucy Bell mask on the right. In that talk that he gave in Louisville in 1972, Gene was asked why he used a grotesque mask. He said,
to make Lucy Bell Crater a somewhat grotesque person, to not make it a sweet, nice-looking lady, but to be a person that could...
and he trails off.
I've used that idea before somewhat in having something very ugly on a fairly well-endowed woman, say, that would completely be a dichotomy of images between the two.
In other words, he uses the mask to shatter the picture plane. Not the picture plane of perspective in visual form, but the picture plane of social expectation and conditioning. The burden of the face from the Renaissance, at least through into the Victorian period, has been the projection of character, or the illusion of character. Today, perhaps, it's a projection of personality, depending on whether you have your portrait made at Bachrach's or J.C. Penney's. But Meadyard is saying look below and beyond your conditioned expectations to the play acting of revealing portraiture. Don't look for a visual transcription of particularities and call it reality. Look for a depiction of reality, something which always lies beyond the realm of mere facts, somewhere off in the land of interpretation and contending truths. It might be instructive to look at what Flannery O'Connor had to say in her essay, The Grotesque in Southern Fiction, in this connection. O'Connor says, "In these grotesque works, we find that the writer has made alive some experience which we are not accustomed to observe every day, or which the ordinary man may never experience in his ordinary life. Yet the characters have an inner coherence. Their fictional qualities lean away from typical social patterns toward a mystery and the unexpected. It is this kind of realism that I want to consider." Realism? What's she talking about? O'Connor and Meatyard thought quite a bit alike here. And we can see it pretty clearly in O'Connor's letters, where she draws a connection between what Etienne Gilson has to say in his 1955 study, Painting in Reality, about Jan van Eyck. Basically, the idea advanced is the same that Meatyard threw in Beaumont Newhall's face in a famous letter that he wrote to him after Newhall fired Nathan Lyons at the height of the photo boom. Namely, that the distinction between representational or realistic and non-representational or abstract was and always had been bogus. And as Meatyard puts it, it's all abstraction. That's the way he put it to Newhall. Gilson, in his book on Painting in Reality, finally asserts that Van Eyck's famous Arnolfini portrait is in fact a total abstraction of the representational elements of reality, and for that reason, and for that very reason, succeeds as a work of art, not a slavish transcription of optical impulses. But Meatyard doesn't stop there in his answer, really, to the thing. He starts talking about his motion and change. He says, and then the idea of changing. And he talks about Steichen repeatedly photographing the shadblow tree behind his house. He said, Lucy Bell changing through the series. You get a different facet of who she is. We're going to talk very briefly now about the linear structure of Lucy Bell, which allows us to trace those changes and also to locate her in that web of relationships that help define her identity, who she is. But when we come to talk about the structure rather than the origins of the meaning per se, we should talk first about the building blocks of that structure, the stanzas in this poem. And the stanzas in this poem, the bricks of it, are the individual images and their captions. But we've already talked about that, haven't we, a good bit. There's only one comment I want to make before sketching the linear structure, and that's about what we call the rhyme scheme derived from O'Connor's story, the way in which each caption begins and ends with the name Lucy Bell Crater. In the world of rhetoric, this arrangement is a kind of chiasma, a crossing over, in which what applies to the first part of the utterance, or the line of poetry, applies equally to the last. Again, you're saying, could Meatyard know such a thing? Might Meatyard have known this fancy term? Well, he very well might, because he would have learned it first in another context, his optical training, because a vital part of the optic nerve is called the optic chiasma. You see it pointed out there. It's the point where crossover occurs, where the impulses from the right eye, for reasons still mysterious to science, are transmitted to the left hemisphere of the brain and vice versa. I take time to mention this not just because it's curious and because it further underscores the framework of the series as a kind of poem, if we see the captions as a modified classical trope, but also because the crossover idea, the interrelatedness of all the persons depicted, but especially Lucy Bell and her husband, is central to the structure of Lucy Bell as a whole. The work begins with the couple in their backyard, a kind of post-Diluvian Eden, with Lucy Bell idly standing with her foot on the neck of the serpentine water hose, and ends with the couple in their grape arbor. As a matter of biographical fact, this image was made on their 25th wedding anniversary, July 3rd, 1971. But if you'll observe closely, you'll notice that the transference here is complete. So withered now by cancer, Jean has put on Madeline's clothes and become Lucy Bell, while she wears his, anticipating the dual parental role she'll soon have to play. But moving from stanzas to a sketch of the larger structure, the sections of the poem are social valences surrounding Lucy Bell and the tacit representation of her husband behind the camera. The scenes break down roughly into 8 sections. You'll see the Mertonian world in the middle, where you heard the Gregorian chant underneath, and you'll see the beginning and end related. You see the kind of relationship between the Wendell Berry Salon and the non-agrarian literati, which include Guy Davenport and Jonathan Williams, and the photo friends. We'll talk about this as we move ahead here quickly. The immediate family runs from image number 1 to image 6, or maybe 7, depending on whether Gene thought Christopher was going to marry his girlfriend Joy Little. He didn't. Ken runs from image 8, Gene's mother Ruth, the sporty real estate sales lady with a Thunderbird there at that time, to number 13, Gene's brother Jerry's daughter. Jerry is an NYU trained art instructor in Florida, as happens. The third section, the Berry Salon, the literary and neo-agrarian friends, begins with image 14, Wendell Berry's wife, Tanya. Berry, of course, is the poet and essayist known for his writing on ecology. It continues through Berry's children, his boyhood chum, Pete Harrod, who accompanied Gene and Wendell on a harrowing trek through the Red River Gorge, working on their book, The Unforeseen Wilderness. 3 days hiking in the water because the brush on the banks was too thick to manage. Gene, already pretty ill with a heart condition, bringing martinis in cans for their evening refreshment. It includes Jonathan Green, who published the first book of Gene's photographs, and his then-girlfriend, a translator of Octavio Paz, Rachel Phillips. It ends with 2 very curious figures who represent a kind of overt nesting of family stories within this linear family narrative. The first is Henley Barnett, the bipolar man on the lower left there with the sled. He's the head of the Baptist Theological Seminary and a champion of integration. His bipolarity, referred to in the caption, does not refer to a chemical imbalance in his makeup, but to the fact that one of his brilliant sons, he had 4 brilliant children, chose to move to Sweden and pursue a scholarly life there rather than submit to being drafted for the Vietnam War. And another of his equally brilliant children served with distinction as a captain of the Air Force in that war. And the story was front-page news at the time, much in the way what we might have stories of one son fighting for the North and the other the South in the Civil War. It was on every magazine and newspaper in the country, from Der Stern to the Louisville Courier-Journal, all over the place. Barnett is followed by the most mysterious figure in the series, the only black person depicted, a woman known for years as the black nurse at Berry's. Notations on the image in the archives say mother, nurse, writer from Dayton. And I haven't identified her yet, but I'm real close. These notations, however, combined with Barnett's prominence as an anti-segregationist, underscore the idea of the interrelatedness of all people, or as Gene put it in the SPE talk, somewhat sotto voce, responding to the idea about the universal aspects of the man, he says, well, they point out that we're a family of man, if nothing else. Again, echoing, of course, the famous 1955 Steichen show, The Family of Man, only done very differently by Gene Meadyard. The Mertonian section is long, 13 images, and it has many levels of special significance in the sequence. I mentioned briefly earlier who Thomas Merton was, the Trappist monk and all that. In his autobiography, The Seven-Storied Mountain, which tells the story of how he decided to give up the worldly life of a Columbia-educated bon vivant and enter into one of the most austere of the Catholic orders. He and Meadyard really hit it off when they met in January of 1967, and his death the next year left a hole in many lives. An interesting fact that my research uncovered is that Tommy O'Callaghan had a special home mass for Gene in 1971, when everyone knew he was dying. The photographs of Mary Traub, the only pregnant woman pictured in the series, the mother of Charles's son Aaron, named, I think, for Aaron Siskin. And, of course, Siskin was one of Meadyard's teachers in that 1956 Indiana workshop. The picture of Mary on the stairs and the picture of Father Basil Pennington, a Merton scholar who offered the Mass, were made on the occasion of the Mass for Gene. So this whole section is a richly layered evocation of memory, of what we now call spirituality, and of life, the fecundity of the O'Callaghan's, and the pregnant Mrs. Traub, and death, Merton's, and standing in the wings, Gene Meadyard's. Contraries combine here strongly, just as they often do in Meadyard's work, this world and a world beyond. Given what I've asserted about the chiasmal structure for this photographic poem, it's probably appropriate to see this section as the crossover point. the Mass is, after all, about the cross. And after all, we are suspended here between the memory of one who has already crossed over, Merton, and one who soon will, Meatyard. The section is the nexus of life and death, perhaps even of resurrection and rebirth. The Lexington Camera Club. The extended family of photo friends who were very important to Meatyard in his life begin with image 41 of Gene's tall sidekick, Bob May, who's an interesting story unto himself, lived with his mother his whole life, the one who went to the garbage in her mink coat. Include Jerry Crouch, Irving Stern, Fred Steffen, and their wives and children. This club played an important role in Gene's creative process. Charles, I'm sure, can tell more about this in a moment. It allowed him to teach and learn by teaching, and to lead and to feel what could be learned by leading. It ends with image 51, the one on the lower right there. Kay Lewis, his secretary at Eyeglasses of Kentucky, his optical shop, which also functioned as a photo gallery, not only for Gene's work, but also the work of many soon-to-be prominent photographers like Charles Crowd, Emmett Gowan, and many others. Kay Lewis was like a daughter, a sister, friend, confidant to Gene and Madeline, part of the family, in other words. She ends this section on an especially warm note, at least to anyone who knows the biographical facts. The non-agrarian literati section begins with image 52 of Guy Davenport, the critic, poet, fiction writer, and lately MacArthur Genius Fellowship winner, who once described Gene Meatyard as the best educated man he'd ever met. They were very close. We've already discussed that. In the upper left is Jonathan Williams, the poet, who was the Jargon Society brought out the only to date existing edition of the family album of Lucy Bell Crater. It includes the poet Roland Johnson there, the big, as Gene described it, obscene coal truck. The seventh section, which I've called Carriers of the Photographic Torch, begins with image number 56 in the upper left of Van Daren Koch, Gene's first serious teacher and an important early influence and advocate of Gene's work. All of these people are people who have or will carry forth into the wider photographic world the legacy of Meatyard's work. They, Emmett Gowan and Edith, C.J. Pressma of the Center for Photographic Studies there in the upper right, and John Church, head of the Photographic Archives there on the wrecked car at the University of Louisville, an important archive, where Gene thought the next generation, these were people he thought were the next generation, the heirs, who photographically speaking would remember his name and his work. And you'll notice that in the end we're moving toward more truly urban settings and away from the suburban Eden in which we began, and certainly away from the derelict, abandoned buildings. But finally, the couple returns to the grape arbor. We return to the blood family, the wine family life, in which the crisscross, the great chiasma of the work, photographic, social, and structural, is complete. It reminds me of those lines from T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets. In our end is our beginning. We return to the place and know it for the first time. So this is the family album of Lucy Bell Crater. A photographic poem which ends as enigmatically as it began. But by now, for me at least, and I think for many attentive viewers, the faces aren't blank and empty. We have filled them, as we do the faces of everyone we meet, with supposed meaning based on a world of suggestive circumstance and cryptic clues. And what redeems us from the despair we might be inclined to feel in our frustration at facing the fact that we can't know, we can only suppose? Humor. At times dark or pointed or silly or edgy or full of puns and bent tributes, humor. It is that variable rhyme scheme that ultimately resolves the enigma of this poem, as so often humor does. It's the saving, forgiving grace that resolves the treasured and terrifying enigma we call family.